I'll say it straight, and you might not like this. The problem isn't that you're not smart. The problem is that you've been taught in a way that made your brain stop thinking without you even realizing it. Sounds unbelievable, right? I get it. In my 50 years of teaching at MIT, Princeton, Cornell, and Caltech, I've encountered some of the best students in America, people who could rewrite Maxwell's equations faster than I could finish a cup of coffee. But then I'd ask them a simple question about the real world, and their entire confidence would collapse like an atomic model made of balloons meeting a sharp needle. Once at Princeton, I asked a student, "Why does a rainbow have colors?" Think about it, this isn't some profound philosophical question. It's something any child has pointed at the sky and wondered about. Yet that student who had memorized entire chapters on optics looked at me as if I just asked him to explain why photons don't play chess. And in that moment I realized something. The ability to repeat knowledge is not the same as the ability to understand. You can look smart, you can sound like an expert, you can get perfect scores. But if you can't connect your knowledge to reality, if you can't explain a simple phenomenon using your own thinking, then it's all just a performance that the education system has trained you to do since you were young. What I'm about to say next might make you question a lot of what you believed about learning, intelligence, and yourself. But if you want to know why smart people keep getting fooled by their own knowledge, why you can know something and actually understand nothing, then you need to hear me out to the end. Because it all starts here from the disastrous confusion between performance and thinking. Over the years I've taught at MIT, Princeton, Cornell, and Caltech, I realized the strangest thing wasn't in the labs or the long equations that made the blackboard look like someone had scribbled graffiti. The strangest thing was in the way people learn, or rather the way they think they're learning. Let me put it bluntly. There are two completely different types of learning, and if you don't distinguish between them, you'll spend your whole life feeling like you get it until reality slaps you hard. One type is performance. You learn to give the correct answer pattern, to get high grades, to look smart in front of teachers, peers, colleagues. This type is like preparing for a stage show. Every answer has to be clean, perfect, no mistakes allowed. You recite information like a copying machine, exact words, exact lines, exact order, and the world applauds. They call you talented, gifted, excellent. But then there's the second type, the one real science actually requires, the one true understanding demands. I call it thinking. Thinking means you learn to grasp principles, to predict on your own what would happen if you change one small thing in the system. Thinking is when you look at a real-world phenomenon and say, I know why it's like that. Thinking isn't repetition, it's recreation. It's not reciting someone else's words, it's building your own understanding. And let me be honest, most of us have been pulled heavily toward the first type of learning without even knowing it. Don't just take my word for it. Look at the data. In 1950, there was a famous study at Harvard to test whether physics students, the ones with the highest scores, actually understood the phenomena their formulas described. The result? They got 60% of basic phenomena wrong, meaning more than half of what they thought was knowledge was actually just floating symbols, disconnected from reality. Can you imagine? People who could orchestrate entire Maxwell's equations couldn't explain why light bends when passing through water. 7 decades later, things haven't improved. A 2018 National Science Foundation report found that 68% of STEM students in the US couldn't describe even one real-world application of the formulas they'd studied over 4 years of college. They could write Ampere's law perfectly, but if you asked how it relates to the electrical system in their own home, they'd look at you like you just asked them to locate an electron in the kitchen. This brings me to a small story from Princeton 1. I'll never forget. One day, I asked a senior student, "Why is the sky blue?" This isn't a philosophical question. It's something any 6-year-old might ask while looking up at the sky. But the student stood there, clutching a stack of notes full of formulas, and couldn't say a word. Not because he was stupid, but because he'd forgotten how to think. When you've been trained too long to give the right answer, you become afraid of being wrong. And when you're afraid of being wrong, you stop daring to experiment. When you stop experimenting, you lose connection to intuition, and when intuition is starved long enough, it withers. The education system has unintentionally created a faulty reflex. It rewards symbolic accuracy over understanding accuracy. It teaches you that mistakes are shameful instead of part of real understanding. And so you start learning like an actor. Memorize lines, play the role correctly, never go off script. But science isn't a script. The real world doesn't operate according to model answers. Ask yourself these two questions. Have you ever learned something, aced the test, but forgotten it completely just a few days later? And have you ever felt like you knew something while reading it, but when you had to explain it to someone else, you were completely lost? If the answer is yes, you don't have a memory problem. You're performing, not thinking. Real knowledge doesn't fall out of your head after a week. Real knowledge sticks to your life. It attaches to images, experiences, feelings, observations. It becomes part of you. But when knowledge stays only on paper, disconnected from reality, it drifts away just as easily as it came. And if this feels familiar, you're about to understand why. To understand why people can learn so much, yet understand so little, why scores can be high but thinking low. I have to tell you about the story in Brazil where I first saw the real root of this problem. This is where everything started to become clear. And it's also where I realized why education can destroy people's ability to think without anyone noticing they're being destroyed. When I say the confusion between performance and thinking is the root of countless problems in education, I'm not saying it for fun or to sound clever. I'm saying it because I witnessed it most powerfully in 1952, when I accepted an invitation to teach at Universidade do Brasil in Rio de Janeiro. Before arriving, I'd already seen plenty of oddities in American education, but the classroom in Brazil was like someone suddenly turning on the lights in a dark room. Everything became so clear it was almost shocking. I walked into a lecture hall with about 80 students. To be fair, they were very likable students. Polite, hard-working, meticulous note-takers with genuine respect for the teacher. But one thing struck me immediately. They had everything memorized. Every equation, every definition, every description from the textbook, to the point I suspected that if you flipped to a random page and misread a single word, they could correct you on the spot. Sounds impressive, right? Unfortunately, no. That kind of memorization is like storing a massive library in your head, but the library door is locked. You have the books, but you can't use them. I realized this when teaching about light polarization. After finishing a section, I asked a question that anyone who truly understands polarization would find completely normal. In which direction is light polarized when reflected off water? A practical question, no tricks, no traps. Yet all 80 students, people who could recite entire chapters on electromagnetism from the textbook, went silent, as if I'd asked them how to calculate the orbit of a fish. I was a bit surprised, so I repeated the question. No one answered. I tried a third time, slower, clearer, hoping someone would give a hint. But nothing. Just thick silence, as if the whole room was waiting for me to answer it for them. That's when I understood. These students weren't lacking intelligence. They were lacking experience. They'd never looked at light reflecting off the sea at Copacabana and wondered, why is it so bright at this angle and darker at that one? They'd never connected the formula to the world outside the window. They learned polarization as a paragraph to memorize, not as a property of light they could see with their own eyes. And if knowledge doesn't touch the real world, it's just dead words. In cognitive science, this phenomenon is called cognitive isolation knowledge. Isolated from real experience, like a piece of information floating in the mind with nothing to anchor it. The human brain never holds on to things like that. Never. It only keeps long-term what has images, emotions, experiences, collisions with life. Everything else is just temporary data, dead data. The Carnegie Foundation saw this early on, between the 1940s and 1960s. They conducted numerous surveys of American school and college students and discovered what they called a rote learning epidemic. Students remembered very well, but understood very poorly. They could recite the definition of work, but not understand why mechanical work involves the direction of force and motion when lifting something. They could write Snell's law but not understand why a spoon in a glass of water looks broken. They could copy Maxwell but not know why the radio in their living room works. And when I stood in front of those 80 students in Brazil, I realized that epidemic wasn't confined to US borders. It was so widespread it felt like a natural part of education. This forced me to change how I taught. I didn't start with formulas. I started with things they could see. When discussing polarization, I talked about the Brewster effect, the phenomenon you can observe with the naked eye, when light reflects at a specific angle and makes polarizing glasses work magically. When discussing diffraction, I didn't start with math. I started with rainbows on razor blades as CD surfaces, where light bends into beautiful colors. When discussing scattering, I pointed to the shimmering bus shadow on hot pavement, where air density changes create optical effects everyone has seen but few can name. I told them if you don't see physics in life, you don't understand physics. And this isn't just true for physics. It's true for every field. You can study economics but not understand markets. You can study psychology but not understand people. You can study math but not see math in the motion of a door or the rhythm of footsteps. You can study engineering but not understand what a bridge is telling you. Disconnect from reality isn't a lack of information. It's a lack of ability to map information onto the real world. That's why I say, and will always say, if knowledge doesn't speak to reality, it disappears. Knowledge detached from life is like an echo in an empty room. It exists for a few seconds, then vanishes without a trace. And when knowledge disappears like that, what do people do? When they can't rely on observation, can't rely on experience, can't rely on internal understanding, they start relying on something else. Authority. They believe the professor because he has credentials. They believe the author because the book cover looks professional. They believe anyone who sounds more confident than they do. And that is the entry point to the second mechanism, the mechanism even more dangerous than disconnection from reality. Because when you don't understand the real world, you hand over the power to understand it to someone else. From here, dependence on authority begins, and humanity's most serious mistakes follow right behind it. The scariest thing about my experience in Brazil wasn't that it was different. It was that it wasn't different at all. It just made the problem glaringly obvious. A problem I'd already seen quietly at MIT in 1939, at Cornell in 1946, and at Caltech after 1951. Many people assume Brazilian students struggled because education there was still young. But no, what I saw in that Rio lecture hall, 80 students memorizing every formula but unable to answer a question about light reflected off water, was simply an exaggerated version of what had been happening silently in every US classroom I'd ever entered. At MIT, I assigned a problem on simple harmonic motion. Students solved it perfectly. Equations, graphs, everything clean. But when I asked, why does a swing oscillate according to the same law? The whole class looked at me as if I'd broken some unspoken rule. They knew the formula, but not the life of the formula. At Cornell, I asked a group about projectile motion. If you throw the chalk lower, does it go farther or shorter? A simple question even kids often ask. But many students got it wrong, not because they lacked math, but because they'd never observed a thrown object in real life. They had the formulas memorized, but they weren't used to looking at the real world. Even at Caltech, where I expected stronger physical intuition, the situation wasn't much different. I pointed to a shadow on the ground and asked, if the sun moves to the left, will this shadow get longer or shorter? And again, the familiar confusion. I recognized a common pattern. Plenty of smart students, plenty of test-acing students, but students who could look at the world and think for themselves were extremely rare. Why? Because they'd been trained in an environment that only rewards results, not observation. Schools create the habit of waiting for the problem, waiting for data, waiting for instructions. Everything is neatly packaged like a math problem box. Give you correct input, demand correct output. But the real world never works that way. It's messy, incomplete information. No teacher standing by to say, this is problem type number 7. And when you're trapped in the exam model too long, the first thing you lose is the ability to observe for yourself. You stop asking, why is it like this? and start thinking, which formula applies in this case? Standardized education turns students into problem-solving machines, not people who understand the world. I've seen hundreds of students who could rewrite Maxwell, but couldn't explain why the radio in the living room works. I've seen students who could analyze an oscillating function but didn't understand why the old swing in the playground moves exactly according to that model. Thinking isn't trained in a grading environment. It's replaced by the ability to predict the next problem pattern. And at that point, you're no longer really looking at the world. You're only looking at the textbook. Brazil just made it too obvious to ignore, but the disease is everywhere. When knowledge isn't tied to reality, it becomes empty symbols. And when people don't truly understand the world, they do what humans always do in confusion. They start believing authority, believing someone who seems to know, instead of learning to verify for themselves. And so, the second mechanism of destroying thinking begins to form. The problem with everything I witnessed, from MIT to Rio, from Cornell to Caltech, boils down to one simple rule that every scientist understands, but the education system keeps ignoring. Reality is the ultimate measure of knowledge, not tests, not rubrics, not grades or standardization. Only reality, the world out there that doesn't care about anyone, doesn't reward anyone, doesn't give anyone a chance to correct their answers. Reality doesn't care what honors you graduated with or how many times you got perfect scores. It only cares about the truth. But what has happened in modern education is that the system has gradually replaced reality with a simulation of reality. Instead of letting students touch the world, we let them touch tests. Instead of letting them observe, we give them checklists. Instead of letting them understand on their own, we give them grading rubrics. Grades become the declaration of understanding, as if reality is simply an extended version of the final exam. Exams are treated like truth machines. They judge who understands and who doesn't, who's smart and who's dumb. But exams know nothing about real intelligence. They only measure the ability to repeat. Rubrics are the same list of artificial criteria teachers use to make sure every student does exactly what the system wants. Then standardization, an idea that sounds noble but paralyzes thinking. Everyone has to learn the same way, think the same way, answer the same way, as if intelligence can be mass-produced. Einstein once said, "If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough." And you know what's interesting? No exam tests whether you can explain what you learned simply. No rubric evaluates whether you can express it in your own words. No standardization requires you to truly understand before moving to the next chapter. In fact, it's the opposite. The education system makes learners complicate their answers to sound smarter, instead of simplifying them to understand deeper. I've met many students who could recite long passages of diffraction theory, but couldn't describe it in one simple sentence. Light bends. A simple but correct sentence. And that simplicity is the mark of real understanding. I often tell my students, reality tests you better than any exam. And that's not flowery talk. It's pure truth. An engineer can get an A in fluid mechanics, but if the bridge he designs collapses, reality doesn't care how many homework problems he did. A doctor can score high in diagnostic theory, but if he misdiagnoses, reality punishes the mistake immediately. A physics student can memorize Maxwell by heart, but if he doesn't understand how a radio works, reality will never consider him someone who understands physics. In science, mistakes can't be covered up with neat work or model answers. Reality exposes everything. It's the only exam you can't flatter, can't beg for points, can't ask teacher, does this count for credit? It has only one answer. Either you understand or you don't. And when an education system replaces reality with performance, it creates a generation that knows how to take tests, get scores, present well, but doesn't know how to look. And when people don't know how to look at the real world, they look for another anchor that's authority. And so the second mechanism destroying thinking begins to emerge. If reality is the ultimate measure of knowledge, then this is the most important question you can ask yourself. How do you know you've lost connection to reality? Trust me, the signs are very clear. You just have to dare to look straight at them. The first sign is a phenomenon I saw in almost every top student I ever taught. You do great on tests, But when you apply that knowledge to a real situation, you're as confused as if you'd never learned it. You can solve a simple harmonic motion equation in 30 seconds, but you don't know why a swing in the playground moves exactly like your homework problem. You can solve an electric field problem in the exam room, but when standing in front of a real electrical wire, you're not sure which way the current flows. You can analyze matrices, but when looking at a company's payroll, you have no idea what rules are at play. That's the sign you're learning not to understand, but to reproduce. And reality doesn't care about your reproduction ability. The second sign is subtler, but even more dangerous. You understand business theory, but when facing a real situation, an angry customer, an employee quitting suddenly, a market shifting, you don't know what to do. I've talked to many engineers, managers, MBA students. All of them can say the right professional sounding words. But when I ask, in real life, how do you apply it? They start stammering. And I know right away they never truly understood. They were just performing. I once met an economics student who could explain the supply-demand principle with beautiful graphs. But when I asked, if today it's 10 degrees hotter, will the price of ice cream pops at the store near your house change? He answered wrong. Not because he was stupid, but because he had never forced himself to see that principle in real life. Then comes the third sign, and perhaps the easiest to recognize. You forget knowledge very quickly. A week ago you memorized a chapter, but today you can't remember it. A month ago you could present a definition like a pro. Today you have to Google it again. Many people think that's poor memory. I say it straight. You didn't forget, you never understood. The brain doesn't store data detached from experience. It only keeps what it can use. Try to remember. Have you ever forgotten how to ride a bike after you learned? No. Have you ever forgotten the color of sunlight? No. Have you ever forgotten where the light switch is in your bedroom? No. But you forget formulas, definitions, theories, because they were never attached to any real experience for the brain to have a reason to keep them. Unused knowledge gets discarded. It has no survival value. It doesn't help you understand, doesn't help you observe, doesn't help you predict. So the brain eliminates it. That's not your fault, it's normal biology. I once told students, if you want to remember something long term, you have to understand it to the point where you see it in the real world. But if you only memorize formulas like a string of characters, it will fall out of your head before you even get to use it. Another sign of disconnection from reality is that you feel dumb when facing real problems, even though you're great in class. You can get straight A's, but panic when you have to fix a broken machine, calculate how much paint to buy for a room, or measure whether a table will fit through a door. You're great at thinking in the artificial space of exams, where everything is clean and complete information. But you fail in the real world, where information is messy and no one is guiding you. That's not because you lack thinking ability. It's because you've never been trained to think. The education system made you used to living in a world with model answers. And when you step outside where there are no model answers at all, you feel lost. That's when you realize you've lost the ability to connect knowledge to reality. And this is the most dangerous consequence. When you don't understand the real world, you stop trusting your own experience. You start trusting others, the textbook, the teachers, the people who sound smarter than you, because you no longer have the ability to judge for yourself what's right or wrong. And that very dependence paves the way for the second mechanism destroying thinking. When people don't cling to reality, they cling to authority. And this is when the second mechanism, destroying thinking, appears, a mechanism more dangerous than disconnection from reality, because it not only makes you fail to understand the world, but also makes you stop believing in your ability to verify the world yourself. I call it abandoning the ability to self-verify. And to make you understand how serious it is, I have to tell you about what happened in 1964, when I served on the California Textbook Committee. Our task was simple: evaluate textbooks to select them for millions of California students. Sounds important, right? And it was important because textbooks shape how a generation will understand science. I joined out of curiosity to see how the selection process worked. But what I witnessed was so unbelievable it made me wonder if I was in a comedy sketch. The meeting began. Publishers sent thick books. Beautiful covers, full color, with introductions from professors at prestigious schools. And right away, I noticed one thing. No one on the committee read the content. No one. They looked at the cover, looked at the author list, looked at the long recommendation letters, looked at whether the publisher was reputable, looked at who praised this book. Everything except the one thing that mattered, the book's content. I started opening each book to actually read. And then a math book was passed to me, one that was introduced with great fanfare, signed off by 3 university professors with a letter praising its tremendous contribution to American education. I turned to the first page and almost laughed out loud. The book was completely blank. Not a single line of text, not a single diagram, not a single exercise, nothing. Just the title printed on the cover. The rest of the pages were pure white. I raised my hand and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this book is blank." The room went silent. I flipped page after page, nothing. I continued, "You didn't check the simplest thing, whether the book actually has any text." And do you know what their reaction was? Confused looks, then embarrassment. No one imagined a blank book could slip through the approval process, but it did. Not because they were stupid, but because they didn't think they needed to verify. The author's reputation, the publisher's prestige, the expert's praise-all made them believe the book must be correct. And that was one of the moments that made me understand clearly. People are very easily deceived by authority. Not because they're weak, but because they've been taught to believe, not to check. Psychology has a name for this. Authority bias, the bias toward trusting someone who appears to have status, credentials, or power. Along with it is credential bias, the bias toward trusting anything labeled expert, professor, PhD, scientist. And research shows this phenomenon is far worse than you think. Look at the Milgram experiment, 1961, one of the most famous studies on obedience to authority. Participants were asked to administer electric shocks to another person, actually an actor, just because a man in a white coat ordered them to. Result, 65% of participants were willing to deliver dangerous shocks simply because an authority figure commanded it. That reveals a hard-to-swallow truth. When people believe someone has power or expertise, they stop judging right and wrong for themselves. And this doesn't just happen in experiments. According to a 2017 Pew Research survey, 78% of Americans will believe information almost immediately if it's tagged experts, say. No verification needed. No reasoning needed. Just the expert label. And that's why the blank math book in that 1964 meeting almost got approved. No one needed to read it because the experts had guaranteed its quality. This is exactly what education unintentionally teaches you. Don't verify, just believe. From childhood, you're punished for challenging teachers. You're reminded when you ask too many why questions. You're seen as rude when you demand evidence. You're encouraged to cite sources, cite names, cite authority instead of checking for yourself whether it's true. Even in essays, they don't ask, "What do you think?" They ask, "What sources did you cite?" A system built around obedience to authority creates people who lose the ability to verify truth for themselves. And then you grow up carrying a dangerous habit, trusting the confident speaker instead of checking reality. You trust credentials over experience. You trust theory over observation. You trust textbooks over what your eyes see. And so the second mechanism destroying thinking operates fully. You abandon verification because you've been taught that verifying is rude. But when you stop verifying, you don't just lose thinking, you lose the ability to distinguish real from fake, right from wrong. And this is what makes the second mechanism particularly dangerous. Smart people are actually more easily deceived by authority than anyone else. It sounds paradoxical, but I've observed this my whole life at MIT students, at highly accomplished researchers, even at NASA. Smart people are often raised in environments where success is measured by the ability to do exactly what's required. From childhood, they've been used to getting high grades, receiving praise, winning in a system where rewards come from doing the assignment right, not from understanding the essence correctly. When the system says, "This is the correct textbook," they believe it. When the system says, "This is the correct answer," they believe it. When the system says, this is the correct expert, they believe that too. And the system never punishes them for believing it, only punishes them for not doing it right. The result is that they develop an invisible dependence on authority, a dependence they don't even notice themselves. I once told students bluntly, the better you are in school, the easier it is for you to believe authority. Because school teaches you that the person who holds the answer is the right one. You don't need to verify. You just need to reproduce what they say. And when you reproduce long enough, you forget that reality doesn't care who's standing at the podium. That's why smart people are easily deceived. They succeeded in an artificial system, and they assume that system represents the real world. But the real world doesn't obey authority. It obeys laws, and laws don't change whether you have a PhD or not. NASA learned this lesson painfully in 1986, before the Challenger space shuttle disaster. The engineers at Morton-Teocol, those who worked directly with the O-rings, warned that cold weather would cause the O-rings to lose elasticity, leading to hot gas leaks and the risk of explosion. They based it on experimental data, on observation, on reality. But NASA leadership people with advanced degrees, big reputations, massive achievements, rejected those warnings. They trusted their own prestige more than the data. They trusted political pressure more than physics. They trusted what should be true instead of what was true. And guess what happened? 73 seconds after launch, Challenger exploded over Florida skies, taking the lives of 7 astronauts. That explosion wasn't due to a lack of intelligence. It happened because the smartest people trusted authority instead of re-verifying reality. They weren't dumb. They were just too accustomed to a reward system that praised compliance. This is something many people don't want to accept. School doesn't teach you to self-verify. School teaches you to trust those in power. If the teacher says it's right, you write it down. If the textbook says it's right, you memorize it. If the expert says it's right, you cite it. And every time you do that, you lose a little bit of your ability to judge for yourself, a little bit of your ability to question, a little bit of your ability to verify. By the time you enter the real world, you carry a dangerous habit. When you encounter something confusing, you don't look at reality, you look to see who said it. Smart people aren't deceived because they lack analytical ability. They're deceived because they believe the authority has already analyzed it for them. And once you've gotten used to trusting authority long enough, the consequences start showing up in subtle but extremely dangerous ways. The first thing that happens is you stop asking, how do we know? The most fundamental question in every field of science, the question any independent thinker must ask before accepting any claim. But when you've spent your whole life in a system where teachers hold the answers, you learn to skip that question. You no longer ask where the evidence is. You no longer ask what the data says. You no longer ask where the assumptions lie. You only ask, who said that? And if the speaker has credentials or stands at the podium, you nod. The second thing, you start judging people by credentials, not by results. You meet someone who calls themselves an expert, and you immediately trust them more than someone without a title, even when the untitled person gets things done and the expert doesn't. You value a PhD's word over a skilled craftsman's, even though the craftsman understands reality more deeply than any textbook. You value theory over observation. You value assertions over evidence. And then you wonder why you make wrong decisions in life simple. You're judging people wrongly. But the worst consequence is the third. You become afraid to ask questions because you're afraid of looking stupid. This is the most serious disease education causes. People are rewarded for correct answers, not for correct questions. From childhood, you're taught that asking too many questions is annoying, is not getting it, is slowing things down, is not as smart as the others. So you stay quiet. You learn to keep every doubt inside. You learn to hide your confusion with model answers. But science doesn't work that way. I've said it hundreds of times, and I'll say it again. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. And I've also said, science is asking questions. Education makes you afraid of that. When you fear questions, you no longer think. You only react. You no longer discover. You only repeat. You no longer live in the real world. You live in the world of answers that others built for you. And when you live like that long enough, you lose the most important thing a human can possess, the ability to look at truth yourself and recognize it. After you've lost connection to reality and handed over your thinking power to authority, the third mechanism destroying thinking begins to emerge, quietly but more ruthlessly than the previous two, the replacement of curiosity with compliance. This is the most dangerous mechanism because it doesn't just affect your knowledge, it affects who you are, how you see the world, how you learn, how you ask questions, and ultimately how you live. To understand this, you have to look at a simple but heartbreaking truth. Children are far more curious than adults. Do you know how many why questions a 5-year-old asks per day? According to the Harvard Child Study in 1967, the average is 40 per day, and some kids hit over 100. Children ask about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why is the cat meow? Why is water hot? Why do I have to go to bed? Why? 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 Curiosity is an innate instinct. You're born with it. But do you know how many why questions a college student asks per day? Close to zero. Not because they suddenly understand everything, not because the world has become less mysterious, not because they run out of questions, but because they've been taught that asking why is dangerous. When I taught at MIT, I saw this more clearly than anywhere else. MIT has some of the smartest students in the world. They can learn a physics chapter overnight, solve problems so hard they make professors sigh, and handle math at a speed that reminds me of my own youth. But what worried me wasn't that they weren't good. What worried me was that they didn't ask why. I'd walk past study rooms and see them sitting in groups, drilling old exam problems, solving one after another. But no one asked, why is this formula correct? No one asked, what happens if we change the conditions? No one asked, where does this formula come from? They only asked, what kind of problem is this on the exam? When I asked one student, do you know why we take the second derivative in the wave equation? He said, because the book says so. That answer, simple, straightforward, and very sad, sums up the entire modern education system. People learn to do it right, not to understand. They learn to test, not to be curious. Curiosity is replaced by compliance. And that's why I kept something that later many people called Feynman's secret notebook. It wasn't really secret, I just didn't show it off. In that notebook, I rewrote everything from scratch. Maxwell's equations, I derived them myself. Schrodinger's equation, I tried reasoning it differently to see if I could find new intuition. Solutions to harmonic oscillation, I tried solving them with non-standard methods. I did it not because I wanted to be different. I did it because I was curious. I wanted to know what was really going on. I didn't believe in formulas just because someone said so. I wanted to verify them myself. And that's something that seems as simple as breathing is exactly what most students lose when they enter the education system. But why is curiosity replaced? There are 4 big reasons, and all of them are products of the modern learning environment. Reason 1, deadlines. When you have to finish 3 labs, 5 assignments, 1 essay, and 1 test in the same week, you don't have time to be curious. Curiosity takes time. Deep thinking takes time. But deadlines don't care how curious you are. They only care if you submit on time. When time is squeezed, the mind automatically switches to survival mode. Finish it. No need to understand. Reason 2, grading. Curiosity isn't graded. Doing it right gets points. Doing it wrong loses points. If you try a new way and get it wrong, points deducted. If you ask too many questions, no extra points. If you think differently, no bonus points. The grading system rewards compliance, not exploration. And after 12 to 16 years of school, you learn the only lesson. Don't be too curious, just follow along. Reason 3, fear of mistakes. Curiosity leads to experimentation. Experimentation leads to errors, but errors are punished, criticized, downgraded. Top students are often praised for being right, so they develop a stronger fear of being wrong than anyone else. And someone who fears being wrong will never be curious. You can't explore and fear getting lost at the same time. Reason 4. Expectation of correctness. Modern education creates the illusion that smart people are always right. So students try to maintain that image. They try to look smart rather than learn smart. And to look smart, they have to avoid anything that might reveal they don't understand. Asking why is admitting you don't get it, so they avoid it. But avoiding questions means avoiding thinking. And when thinking dies, curiosity dies with it. That's the moment you stop being an explorer of knowledge. You become an executor of instructions. You become a memorizer, not an understander. You become a complier, not a discoverer. And this, the replacement of curiosity with compliance, is the most perfect mechanism education has ever created for destroying thinking. No threats needed. No force needed. Just grade you in a way that makes you forget how much you once loved learning. And that's why when I look at students at MIT, Cornell, Caltech, or Rio, I never judge them by their grades. I look at the questions they ask, because I know a curious person can learn anything. A compliant person only knows how to repeat. Losing curiosity doesn't just make you learn less effectively. It directly attacks your ability to create, the one ability that lets humans make something new instead of just repeating what's already there. When curiosity dies, creativity has no ground to stand on. You no longer ask yourself, what if I try it another way? No longer experiment with untrodden paths. No longer reason outside the template. You become great at simulating, but terrible at discovering. One consequence I saw clearly in MIT students is that they solved exercises brilliantly. But when faced with a problem that had never appeared in a book, they were as confused as if their intelligence had been unplugged. Not because they lacked ability, but because they no longer had the habit of creating new methods. They were only used to copying existing methods. When a formula didn't apply, they didn't know what to do. They stood still. They waited for the answer. They looked for an expert to ask. This doesn't just happen in physics. It happens in business, art, engineering, medicine. When curiosity dies, every field becomes one big school exercise. Model answers exist, standard procedures exist, no need for further invention. But reality never operates like school exercises. It's messier, more open, and demands that the solver look at the problem from an unprecedented angle. Curiosity is the engine that lets you do that. A powerful piece of evidence comes from Stanford's famous 1974 experiment on intrinsic motivation was. In the experiment, children were divided into two groups. One group was simply allowed to draw, the other was promised rewards for drawing nicely. The result was surprising. The rewarded group started drawing less, with less passion, and creativity dropped sharply. When external motivation appeared, internal motivation gradually died. This is no different from modern education. When you learn for grades, for tests, for pressure, you lose the joy of self-discovery. When curiosity is no longer the goal, it becomes a burden. The brain no longer sees learning as exploration. It sees it as a task. And tasks don't need creativity. They just need completion. I've met many students with excellent math skills, but no idea how to approach new problems because they were never encouraged to stray from the beaten path. They were never praised for finding non-standard methods. Sometimes they were even penalized for not doing it the way the teacher instructed. When a system punishes creativity and rewards compliance, that system kills the ability to generate independent ideas. Think about this. Every major scientific discovery began with curiosity. Why did that beam bend? Why did the apple fall? Why does the compass needle point that way? But when you extinguish the question why, you simultaneously extinguish the ability to see what others don't see. You no longer discover anything. You just operate within frameworks others created. A generation without curiosity will not create new science. They will only manage old science. They won't build the future. They will only operate the past. And the biggest consequence is this. When you no longer have curiosity, you lose the very ability to become an independent thinker. Someone who doesn't ask new questions can't have new answers. Someone who doesn't look at the world with their own eyes, only sees it through someone else's lens. That makes you a copy, an intelligent copy, with one incapable of creating anything original. That is the deepest loss education can cause. The experience of declining curiosity and exploratory ability didn't just come to me in Brazil. In fact, Brazil only made the problem too obvious to ignore. I had seen the same phenomenon much earlier, in places considered the intellectual centers of America. At MIT in 1940, where some of the smartest young students you could imagine gathered, I discovered something strange. They memorized lessons amazingly well, but didn't understand the simple phenomena their own formulas described. I asked one student, if a pendulum is pulled farther, how does the period change? He answered immediately, it doesn't change, because the formula T equals 2 pi force carriage, L/G has no amplitude. But when I told him to look at the real pendulum right in front of him, he was surprised to see the period did change a little. The formula hid that because it was an approximation for small amplitude. But since no one taught them to look at reality, they never discovered that discrepancy. Their knowledge lived in the textbook, not in the real world. By Princeton in 1942, I saw another manifestation of the problem. Basic experiments were done wrong simply because students didn't understand the experiment's purpose. They knew the procedure, but not the meaning. I remember an optics lab where students had to measure the angle of refraction. They followed every step of the instructions perfectly, but didn't observe the phenomenon, didn't check if the light converged correctly, didn't ask themselves if the results made sense. One group even submitted completely wrong results because they left the table tilted a few degrees, ruining the entire experiment, but still didn't notice anything wrong. When I asked, did you see the light beam deviate? They replied, no, we just followed the instructions. They didn't observe. They just did. Reality was no longer the teacher. The textbook replaced it. By Cornell, from 1946 to 1951, I met a different kind of student, extraordinarily good at math, but lacking physical intuition. It sounds strange, but it was very real. I gave them complex problems. They solved them like lightning, presented beautifully like printed books. But when I asked something like, why is your shadow longer in the morning than at noon? They were stumped, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they had never looked at the world with a physicist's eyes. For them, physics was a collection of equations. The real world was something unrelated to exams. I once brought a flashlight to class, shone it on the table, and asked, why are the edges of the shadow blurry? One student said, I don't know, but there must be a formula for that. A formula? Sure there is. But you don't need a formula to see that the light source has area, so the shadow can't be as sharp as a laser beam. That's obvious if you bother to observe. But that very ability to observe is the first thing lost when curiosity is extinguished. What made me think a lot is that at MIT, Princeton, and Cornell, 3 of the world's top intellectual environments, the problem was strangely the same. When Brazil happened in 1952, many people thought it was because Brazil's education system was weak. But I knew the problem was much deeper. Brazil wasn't an exception. It just made the problem more glaring. In Brazil, everything was extreme. Students memorized every word but couldn't answer a simple question about reflected light. But at MIT, Princeton, and Cornell, the problem still existed, only covered up by better performance and higher test-taking ability. The same disease, just different severity. Wherever students are rewarded for simulating rather than understanding, curiosity gradually dies. Wherever compliance is valued over discovery, scientific intuition erodes. Wherever grades are placed above reality, learners lose connection to the very world that science tries to explain. Curiosity-driven and curiosity-suppressed are not just two different states, they are two completely opposite paths of intelligence. I realized this while observing students everywhere I taught. Some learn because they genuinely want to know what's really going on, and others learn because the exam is next week. These two types can use the same textbook, the same lab, the same equations, but their brains operate on two entirely different mechanisms. Curiosity-driven learning is when you learn because you can't stand not knowing. You see a strange phenomenon. You want to touch it, turn it, test it, break it, put it back together, see if it works differently. When curiosity leads, knowledge isn't content to memorize. It's a secret to uncover. Your brain literally lights up. Dopamine rises, memory lasts longer, reasoning goes deeper. You learn fast but don't feel tired. You learn a lot but don't feel forced. In contrast, compliance-driven learning happens when you learn only to meet someone else's expectations, grades, tests, degrees, or fear of looking stupid. You don't learn because you want to know, you learn because you have to know. Your brain doesn't open to explore, it contracts to protect. You try not to be wrong instead of trying to understand. You optimize for safety, not for truth. I once told my students, if you're really curious about a magnet, you'll play with it. If you're studying for the test, you'll just read the definition. That's the biggest difference education usually ignores. The curious person will take the magnet near a nail, then near a coin, then near aluminum, and wonder why some things get attracted and others don't. The compliant person will read, magnets attract metals containing iron, and note it down for next week's test. Those two people aren't just learning differently. They become two different kinds of minds. One can observe, reason, shift perspectives, discover laws on their own. The other only knows how to repeat, wait for answers, and hope they remember enough to pass the exam. What worries me most is that the education system unintentionally works to extinguish the first type of learning and nurture the second. When curiosity leads, you accept mistakes as a natural part of the journey. But in the compliance model, mistakes are shameful. When curiosity leads, you dare to ask simple but important questions like, why is it like that? But in a compliance environment, that question makes you look less smart. In every conversation about science, I emphasize one thing. Curiosity is the most powerful engine of intelligence, not IQ, not grades, not titles, but the ability to look at the world and feel compelled to understand it. Curiosity is what turns an ordinary child into a scientist. It's also what the education system somehow has caused so many people to lose as they grow up. Why did I escape this system? Many people think I'm different because I'm specially smart, but that's a comforting myth people create so they don't have to face the truth. I didn't escape through intelligence. I escaped through habits planted very early when I was still a boy in Queens, New York. My father was the first man who taught me how to look at the world. He wasn't a scientist, but he had a simple, powerful educational philosophy, stronger than any school. Before you learn the words, learn the real animal, the real object, the real phenomenon. If I asked, what kind of bird is that? He wouldn't answer right away. He'd say, its name isn't as important as knowing what it's doing, how it flies, how it tilts its wings when the wind changes direction. From very early on, he pulled me away from labels and brought me to reality. No textbook needed, no definitions needed. He took me walking in the park, showed me how light reflects on water, how a leaf curls up before rain, how an object moves before you learn any formula about motion. He said, if you don't observe for yourself, you'll never really understand. That sentence followed me my whole life. Thanks to him, I developed 3 habits that later became my immune system against the damage of standardized education, self-reasoning, self-verification, and refusing to blindly trust authority. When I was little, instead of reading to me that kinetic energy is y square, my father put a ball on a slope and told me to watch. If it goes twice as fast, does the energy double? I ran back and forth measuring, retrying, repeating, then started reasoning the connection between speed and energy. I didn't know calculus yet, didn't know derivatives, didn't know integrals, but I knew the real world. And from the real world, I found the law. Years later, when I had the mathematical tools, I re-derived the kinetic energy formula from scratch and realized I had understood its essence before I even knew its name. When I was about 11, I got curious about the trajectory of spinning toys, so I created my own notation system to describe rotational motion, then experimented with ball bearings, jar lids, anything that could spin. I hadn't studied any chapter on rotational mechanics, but I grasped its intuition because I wasn't learning to answer a test. I was learning to answer myself. The second habit my father planted was self-verification. He always asked me, "How do you know?" Not to make it hard on me, but so I'd understand that anything I believed, from small things to big, had to be based on personal verification. If I said, "I think the leaf changes color because it's tired," he didn't laugh, didn't yell, didn't correct. He just said, "Good. Now check if that hypothesis is right." He taught me that being wrong isn't scary. Not verifying is scary. Later, when I entered the education system where people feared being wrong so much they didn't dare ask questions, I already had armor protecting me from that fear. The third habit, perhaps the most important, was not believing authority just because they had a title. My father said, "A man in a white coat doesn't make his words truer. You have to check for yourself." That sentence went straight into the DNA of my thinking. It's why I wasn't afraid to question professors at MIT, at Princeton. Why I wasn't afraid to tell an education committee they almost approved the blank book. Why I dared challenge NASA when they hid data about the O-rings. Not because I was smart, but because I kept the ability not to believe something just because it was said by someone important. Many people are surprised to learn my IQ is only around 125 high, but not the genius level people imagine. I'm not a new Einstein. I'm not innately better than anyone else. The only thing I had, the thing you also had when you were a child, was a brain that hadn't been distorted by fear of mistakes, grade pressure, and compliance habits. I've said it before, and I'll repeat it here. I'm not smarter than you. I just kept my brain from getting broken. The education system didn't defeat me because my father taught me to look at the world myself before the system could teach me to look at it through textbooks. And if I could escape, you can too, but first you have to understand what's been destroyed and what can still be saved. When I arrived at Los Alamos during World War II, where the brightest minds in America gathered to build the atomic bomb, I saw another proof of the power of curiosity and verification, and the danger when people trust authority too much. Los Alamos was a place where everything was sealed, locked, vaulted, labeled top secret, and operated under the assumption that every security system worked perfectly. But I never believed anything just because someone said it was safe. I had to verify, not because I liked to rebel, but because I knew every human-made system has flaws, and those flaws won't reveal themselves unless someone gets curious and looks for them. One day, I stood in front of a colleague's safe, not to mess around. I wanted to check how well classified documents were protected. We were building the most powerful weapon in the world, and if security failed, the consequences would be unimaginable. I observed the safe, looked at the dial, the fingerprints, the way my colleague operated it, every time he opened it. I wasn't a safe expert, but I had what every scientist has: curiosity. I wanted to know, was this safe really as secure as everyone thought? I started noticing unconscious habits. The colleague often spun the dial to the same region before entering the code, sometimes muttered numbers, sometimes didn't turn enough revolutions. Those tiny clues aren't things you see if you learn for compliance. They're things you only see when you're curious. I experimented gradually, reasoned step by step, tested my hypotheses by turning the dial, listening to the mechanical sounds inside, feeling changes in resistance. No instructions, no simulation graphs, no expert guiding me, just reality and my own observation ability. The result: I opened the safe. Not once, but many times. Not one safe, but many safes. I even opened safes belonging to top physicists, people with superior intellect who believed in the safety just because someone in uniform said it was designed so no one could open it. When I reported my findings, many thought I was mischievous or disruptive, but the truth is I was doing what every security system needs but rarely gets: verifying reality. Los Alamos wasn't safe just because there were regulations. It was only safe if the regulations were correct, and only someone curious would discover when they were wrong. I always emphasize, I didn't open safes to show off. I opened them to make sure the world's most dangerous documents weren't behind a door that only appeared secure. What enabled me to do it wasn't high IQ or knowledge of mechanics. It was three things: Curiosity, observation, and verification. The exact three habits my father planted in me as a child. I didn't believe the safe was secure just because someone said it was. I didn't believe the procedure was well designed just because someone said so. I had to check for myself. Curiosity led me to the question. Observation gave me clues. Verification gave me the real answer. That's why I always say, curiosity equals verification equals real understanding. If you don't verify, you'll believe in an empty safe. If you aren't curious, you'll never try to open it. What I learned at Los Alamos wasn't just about safes. It was about every field of thinking. When you look at the world with curious eyes and verify everything instead of trusting authority, you see things others miss. You solve problems others don't notice. You avoid mistakes others think are truth. Los Alamos proved to me what I later tried to pass on to every student. Curiosity is radar. Verification is compass. Someone with both would always find the truth, even when smarter people get lost. Looking back at everything I've witnessed from MIT, Princeton, Cornell, to Brazil, to Los Alamos, I gradually realized a hard-to-swallow but undeniable truth. The education system isn't failing. It is succeeding at exactly the wrong goal it was designed for. People often think education is broken because it produces rote learners, people afraid of mistakes, lacking curiosity, dependent on authority. But if you look at the history of American education from about 1910 to 1950, you'll see it wasn't an accident. It was design. In the early 20th century, the United States transformed into the world's fastest industrializing economy. Leaders at the time, strongly influenced by Henry Ford's assembly line model, believed the country needed a workforce that followed procedures, followed instructions, could repeat tasks consistently, and didn't ask too many questions. They didn't need curious workers. They needed replaceable ones. And so, American education was designed exactly like a factory. Schedules like work shifts, bells signaling class changes, classrooms like production lines, students grouped by age, standardized tests like quality control checks. This isn't speculation. Education documents from that period stated clearly the goal of the system was to train people to fit industrial needs, not to train thinkers. By the 1920s and 1930s, standardized testing exploded. Those tests weren't created to measure understanding. They were created to classify students quickly and cheaply, like sorting pots. That was the period when education officially shifted from curiosity-driven learning to compliance-driven learning. Students were taught, be on time, sit still, don't cause trouble, memorize instructions, do exactly what's assigned, that's success. Asking questions, not in the rubric. Creativity, not necessary. Observing reality, not on the test. Curiosity, inefficient on the knowledge assembly line. What you needed was the ability to complete repeated tasks, like an assembly worker. That is the DNA of modern education. When you understand that origin, you see that what we call flaws today are actually successful products of the original design. The system wanted compliance, and it created exactly compliant people. The system wanted good test takers, and it created exactly good test takers. The system wanted people who didn't ask questions, and it eradicated the habit of questioning in millions of students. When you look at the 2019 OECD report on the decline of reasoning skills, it's clear. Nearly 42% of American students couldn't reason from simple facts to logical conclusions. In the 2022 NAEP assessment, science and math showed the sharpest drop in problem-solving ability in 30 years, but memorization ability stayed the same. What does this show? That the system is still doing well what it was designed to do. Teach students to memorize, not teach them to think. I once said in a lecture, the system produces exactly what it wants, people who follow instructions. If you assign an assembly line the task of making identical nails, it won't produce diamond rings. If you build schools like an assembly line, they won't produce independent thinkers. They'll produce perfect copies of a human model, obedient, manageable, measurable, evaluable, replaceable. Yet the tragedy is, we no longer live in the 20th century. The modern world doesn't need compliant workers. It needs creative, adaptable people who ask questions. But the education you went through is still based on that old design, still teaching you to behave like a cog in an industrial chain. And so you enter the new world with the mindset of the old world, a mindset that no longer fits. The truth is, the education system has never been broken. It has only succeeded at a mission that today has become useless and sometimes even harmful. When I see students lose the ability to be curious, lose the ability to verify, lose the ability to observe, I don't blame them. I know they're just products of a machine much larger than they are. But like every machine, it can be changed, starting with you recognizing how it's operating and deciding where you want to stand in that entire structure. When you look broadly across society, you'll see that the three mechanisms destroying thinking disconnection from reality, abandonment of verification, and replacement of curiosity with compliance not only weaken individuals, but also weaken the largest organizations where the most credentialed and intelligent people are concentrated. This answers a question many still don't understand. Why do highly credentialed people still make colossal mistakes? The mistakes don't come from lack of knowledge. They come from lack of independent thinking. The 1986 Challenger space shuttle explosion is the most tragic proof. Morton tire call engineers clearly warned that the O-rings would lose elasticity at excessively low temperatures and fail to seal, leading to hot gas leaks. They weren't basing it on feelings. They had data. They had experiments. They had reality. But NASA leadership people with higher degrees, bigger titles, greater power ignored those warnings. Why? Because their own authorities said otherwise. Because they trusted the schedule, trusted political pressure, trusted predictive models that said risk is within acceptable limits. But reality knows nothing about acceptable limits. Reality only knows physics, and physics said the O-rings would fail. 73 seconds after launch, Challenger exploded, taking the lives of 7 astronauts. This mistake didn't come from stupidity. It came from authority bias, the bias of trusting power over data, over engineers, over reality. The smartest people in the nation had lost the ability to ask the single most important question: how do we know? They had been taught to trust models, trust procedures, trust reports, trust by the book. They hadn't been taught to doubt. This mistake doesn't only happen in space science. It happened in the 2008 economy when every top expert predicted market stability based on elegant mathematical models that completely failed to reflect real human behavior. The models assumed house prices would never fall nationwide, an assumption so unrealistic it was embarrassing. But the experts trusted the models over reality because the models were created by important people, published in prestigious journals, and used as standard by major banks. When the bubble burst, the entire financial system collapsed, not because of lack of information, but because those with information didn't know how to re-verify it against reality. They confused complexity with accuracy. They confused reputation with truth. They confused models with the real world. But the place where the consequences of abandoning independent thinking are clearest and most dangerous is medicine. Doctors are one of the groups trained in protocol without thinking. Follow the procedure first, ask questions later, or never ask questions at all. I've taught them many doctors and noticed the same pattern as with students. They were taught that mistakes are unacceptable, so they learned a fully compliant model. Correct protocol equals safe. But what happens when the protocol is wrong? When recommendations are outdated? When conclusions from a medical committee are built on unverified data? When a drug is approved just because the authority guarantees it? Medicine is full of such examples. Treating stomach ulcers with acid-reducing drugs for decades while the real cause was the H. pylori bacterium, overprescribing antibiotics based on old guidelines, even though reality shows severe resistance consequences. Treating heart disease according to outdated predictive models. The reason is simple. Experts aren't taught to doubt. They're taught to comply. They're taught that the system is right. They're taught that protocol is truth. But learning that way isn't science, it's religion. Science requires you to always ask, is this true? Where's the evidence? What happens if conditions change? Does reality agree with the model? But when education replaces curiosity with compliance, people lose the ability to ask those questions. And when people lose the ability to ask those questions, they make big mistakes, very big ones. no matter how many degrees, titles, or social status they have. I once said something many people don't like to hear. People with degrees aren't taught to doubt. They're taught to repeat, to comply, to follow procedure. But reality, the one thing that never lies, demands constant doubt. Without it, entire society becomes a victim of authority bias. Humanity's biggest mistakes don't happen because of a lack of smart people. They happen because smart people don't know how to verify for themselves what they believe. And when you understand that, you'll see why we need a completely different way of learning. When you look at all three mechanisms at once, you'll see they don't just exist in parallel. They connect, reinforce each other, and create a self-sustaining loop I call the loop of pseudo-thinking. It starts with mechanism 1. You disconnect knowledge from reality. You learn formulas without seeing phenomena. You learn definitions without observing the world. You memorize everything but truly understand nothing. You have information but no intuition. You have words but no experience. And when the knowledge in your head isn't verified by the real world, you can't distinguish what's true from what's false. From there, mechanism 2 immediately activates. Mechanism 2, you start trusting authority. When reality is no longer the teacher, you have to find another teacher, the textbook, the professor, the credentialed person, the recognized model. You no longer ask, is this true? You ask, who said this? You no longer think with your own head. You think with someone else's. You hand over verification power to them and lose it in yourself. The danger is that this authority becomes convenient. It tells you what to do, what to think, what to believe. It makes you feel safe, so you rely on it even more. But that reliance leads you into mechanism 3. Mechanism 3, curiosity disappears. When you trust authority, you no longer have reason to ask questions. When you stop asking questions, your brain no longer trains the ability to explore. When you stop exploring, you gradually lose the joy of learning. And when that joy is gone, all knowledge becomes a task, not an adventure. You don't want to be wrong, don't want to experiment, don't want to break patterns. You just want to do it right. And the loop closes. You aren't curious, so you don't observe reality. You don't observe reality, so you don't truly understand. You don't truly understand, so you trust books. You trust books, so you don't ask why. You don't ask why, so you never truly understand. From there, everything repeats like a wheel locked in a deep rut. Pseudo-thinking replaces real thinking. I've seen this loop everywhere I've taught. Students at MIT, Princeton, Caltech, Cornell, all caught in the same spiral, just at different levels of sophistication. Brazilian students made the loop more obvious because everything there was more naked, but the mechanism was identical. A person starts not truly understanding, clings to materials, depends on authority, just stops asking questions, understands even less truly. The loop appeared at NASA, leading to Challenger. It appeared on Wall Street, leading to 2008. It appeared in medicine, leading to clinical errors. Every system risks collapse when the people inside lose independent thinking ability and lose it without even knowing they've lost it. I call this loop the loop of pseudo-thinking because it creates the illusion of thinking. You feel like you understand, but you're only simulating understanding. It's empty knowledge presented skillfully. It's surface logic without real foundation. It's performative intelligence, not real intelligence. When all three mechanisms operate together, people can study for decades and still not know how to think. And the scariest part? They believe they are thinking. That illusion is the real tragedy. Because if you don't know you're trapped, you'll never look for a way out. So how do you escape this loop? If you've seen yourself trapped in the loop of pseudo-thinking, the good news is this: your brain can be fixed. It isn't permanently broken. It was just trained wrong. And I'll show you how to fix it with the method later called the Feynman technique, but for me, it's simply the most natural way humans learn. Truly understand. Don't pretend to understand. And the interesting thing is, this method doesn't start with formulas, doesn't start with textbooks, doesn't start with memorization. It starts with you. Step 1, choose a concept you want to understand. It doesn't have to be anything advanced. Pick something you genuinely want to know. What is entropy? What is profit? How do human emotions work? Why do we believe what we believe? Or why is the sky blue? The important thing is real curiosity, not curiosity for exams. When you choose something that lights up your brain, you've already gone halfway to real understanding. Step 2. Explain it in your own words, as if teaching a 10-year-old. This is the most important step. When you try to explain something simply, you force yourself to grasp the essence. You can't rely on jargon. You can't hide behind definitions. You have to face reality head on. Do you understand or not? I'll give you a few examples. Try explaining entropy. If you say, entropy is a measure of the disorder of a system, you don't understand yet. That's a quote from a book. But if you say entropy increases when things become harder to predict, like when your room gets messier, there are more ways for it to be messy, but only one way for it to be tidy, then you're starting to understand. Or try explaining business to a child. If you say business is optimizing profit through resource management, you're just repeating freshman year lecture. But if you say business is when you buy something cheap and sell it higher, or make something people need and they pay you for it, then you truly understand the essence. Or try explaining human emotions. If you say emotions are biochemical responses regulated by the limbic system, you're just reciting neuroscience. But if you say people have emotions because that's how the brain tells us what matters and what needs attention, you're touching reality. Anything you can't explain, simply you don't understand. That's the rule, no exceptions. Step 3. Identify gaps in your understanding. When you start explaining, the places where you stumble are golden signals. They show you only know the words, not understand the meaning. For example, explaining entropy, you might realize you don't know why entropy always increases. Explaining business, you might realize you don't understand why profitable companies still go bankrupt. Explaining emotions, you might realize you don't understand why people both fear and like uncertainty. Those gaps are the starting point of thinking. School wants you to hide gaps, because only when you face not understanding can you begin to understand. Step 4. Go back to the material and simplify again. After finding gaps, return to books, videos, or reality to fill them. But unlike before, you don't read to remember. You read to understand. Once you have more knowledge, try explaining again, this time simpler. Then simpler still. If you can keep going until it sounds like everyday conversation, you truly understand. I'll give you a complete practical example. Suppose you want to understand why ice floats on water. The book might say, due to the crystal lattice structure of water in solid state having lower density than in liquid state. Sounds very scientific, but no one understands it. When water gets cold, its molecules create spaces between them. Like when you pack balls into a box. Packed tight, it's heavy. Packed loosely, it's lighter. Ice is water packed loosely. That's real understanding. Now it's your turn. Try practicing. Pick a concept you think you understand but aren't sure about. Interest rates, AI, sadness, gravity, blockchain, trust. Write the simplest explanation you can. Find where you can't explain clearly. Redo until a 10-year-old would understand. I've told students over and over, if you can't teach it to a child, you don't understand. Many laugh when they hear it, but they don't realize that sentence is the operating principle of your brain. Simplification is the strongest test of thinking. Complication is easy. Anyone can do it. Just use enough jargon. But simplification to the point where truth reveals itself. That's the work of real intelligence. I fully believe anyone can learn better, understand deeper, think clearer if they start using this method every day. Try picking any concept right now and explaining it. Don't care if you sound smart. Care only about one thing. Do you truly understand? Thinking doesn't start with cleverness. It starts with honesty about what you know and what you don't. If my method helps you fix how you understand, then the next step, more important, more foundational, is restoring curiosity. The thing the education system extinguished in you for years without you noticing. And the strangest part is, Restoring curiosity doesn't require intelligence, doesn't require foundational knowledge, doesn't require credentials. It only requires you to return to the way the brain was designed to learn, learning through wonder. Humans don't learn best when forced. Humans learn best when captivated. Children learn fast, not because they're smarter than adults, but because they never lost the curiosity loop. See, trash, tosh, tar, observe and understand, more curious, ask again. That's the natural loop of intelligence. Once you restore this loop, you'll learn so fast, you'll surprise yourself. But how to restore it? The answer is simpler than you think. First step, learn something useless. Yes, useless. Something unrelated to work, that doesn't make money, doesn't give grades, has no practical value at all. Why? Because when you learn something useless, you learn not for compliance, but for curiosity. That's where the brain's shackles come off. Learn to fold origami. Learn why cats purr. Learn why ice cream melts faster in a metal bowl. Learn to identify stars in the sky. When you learn without external goals, you reactivate internal motivation, the motivation the system killed long ago. Second step, random experimentation. Curiosity doesn't come from knowing in advance what will happen. It comes from not knowing and wanting to find out. Do things where you're unsure of the outcome. Drop a leaf in running water and predict where it goes. Spin an object on a table and guess which way it stops. Cook a dish by taste instead of recipe. Change one small variable at work and see what happens. No test, no failure, only observation. As my father once told me, if you want to understand, play with it. When you experiment, your brain works like a scientist, not a rote learner's. Third step, observe the world like a scientist. This sounds grand, but it really just means don't walk through the world as if it's already familiar. Every time you see something strange, don't ignore it. Ask, why is it like that? Why does the light bulb flicker when the washing machine runs? Why does a mirror make objects look farther? Why do train tracks bend when hot? Why don't fish sink to the bottom of the lake? Why does your voice sound different when recorded? Those questions aren't childish. They're questions from adults who want to see the world with real eyes, not eyes trained by textbooks. I've told countless students, curiosity is the real education, not tests, not grades, not honors lists. Just restore your ability to ask why, and you will awaken the strongest part of your brain. The day curiosity returns is the day you start truly learning again. So right now, pick something small, harmless, seemingly unimportant, and ask about it. Then try. Then observe. That's the first step to reclaiming the brain the education system unintentionally dulled. And when that curiosity loop revives, you'll see your thinking change in ways you never thought possible. The most important thing I want you to carry away after everything we've gone through is this. You aren't broken. You were just taught wrong. No one took away your ability to think. It's only covered in dust from years of learning to get it right instead of learning to understand. And the wonderful thing is, anyone can reclaim that ability. No genius required, no high IQ, just a willingness to look at yourself with the honesty science demands. Remember the three mechanisms that kept you in the loop of pseudo-thinking. First, disconnection from reality makes you learn empty knowledge without roots in the real world. Second, abandoning verification makes you trust authority over evidence. Third, curiosity replaced by compliance makes you stop asking questions, the only thing that can bring you back to real understanding. But those three mechanisms also have three escapes. You can reconnect to reality by observing, experimenting, and cross-checking knowledge with the real world. You can reclaim verification by asking the question, education made you forget. How do we know? You can restore curiosity by learning for pleasure, exploring useless things, and looking at the world as if you've never seen it before. None of that requires a new system, no new schools, no new textbooks. It only requires you, the real you, not the standardized version. I once said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself. and you are the easiest person to fool. And this has never been truer than in education. The system makes you believe you understand just because you answered correctly. When you wrote "learn" long enough, you can fool yourself into thinking you understand. But reality can't be fooled. Reality will test you through experiments, through mistakes, through moments when formulas no longer help and you have to think for yourself. That's when you see clearly what you know and what you don't. That's science. That's independent thinking. And that's where your brain starts coming back to life. I'm not asking you to become a physicist. I'm not asking you to rederive Schrodinger's equation or crack safes like at Los Alamos. I'm only asking one thing. Start asking why. Again, when you ask, why does light reflect like that? Why does the market behave like that? Why do I feel this way? Why do I believe this but not that? You're doing what every scientist from Galileo to Einstein did. You're bringing your intelligence back to the real world. You're learning not to perform but to understand. You're thinking not to be praised but to find truth. You're living not as a complier but as an explorer. Remember this. If you start asking why again, you've already started living like a scientist. I believe in your learning ability more than you believe in it yourself, because I know your intelligence was never destroyed. It's just waiting to be freed from the wrong learning habits you unintentionally absorbed. Starting today, take back your brain. You'll be surprised by what you yourself can understand. If you want to continue this journey of discovery with me, please subscribe so you don't miss the next lessons. See you in the next conversation, where we'll have many more interesting things to uncover together.